All right, we're live on YouTube. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see people showing up. Today, Broker Bob and Mark Miller will be reviewing the updates that CAR made to some documents, as well as a new form that's come out as well, too. On YouTube. Welcome, everybody. So let me get that. Sorry. Today. So what I've done is I've dropped in the chat box the December 2020 quick look at all the forms that have been either revised, updated, or new. So you'll want to grab that. And then I also put in there the brand new one, that the COP that's been updated, and we'll explain what that is all about. So let's get going. Ha! I put the wrong one in there.
Oops.
Oops. Sorry, guys. Sorry, downloaded the wrong one. All right. So twice a year, CAR will go through their library of documents that need to be either revised or they release new forms. Fortunately, this year they didn't do a major release that they've done like they've done in the past. So that's a good thing. Sometimes they'll do about 10 or 20 forms all at once. But what we're going to cover today primarily is the COP, which is the contingency for sale of buyer's property. This form is used when you're representing a buyer, a seller, that wants to go out and buy something else. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the SPR. You're representing a buyer that is buying something, but they have a house to sell. So when you write your offer, you're going to attach it with the COP, and the COP basically outlines this as a contingency for that buyer to be able to make that purchase based upon the sale of their existing home that they're in. And the good thing about this update is it clears up so much confusion that was in the outdated COP. Now, these forms will be updated 12/20 in the CAR library. And Mark, at that point, this isn't in any template, so no templates are going to be updated, correct?
Yeah, well, the way that the templates work is that when any new form is released, if you have an existing zip form transaction, the forms are not updated. If you create a new zip form transaction, then the most current version of the form is added to the new transaction.
So if you have templates, stop using them. Mark's already made them for you.
Yeah, I don't think too many people, I don't think anybody really has any templates because they, have just been using our global templates that we've created.
Perfect. All right, so since the COP has been updated, then that means they needed to make an update to the CR, which is the contingency removal form, as well as the notice to buyer to perform, because that will change the guidelines on that as well too. And then we won't talk about the FHDA, we'll just mention it. That's the Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory. They actually released that in October, and we've been using that. And then we'll discuss another new form that they've updated. It's the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. And this form is going to be used for homes that are located in high or very high fire hazard severity zones. And we'll talk a little bit about what we talked about last Friday on the CAR call and when you'll use that. The form is a rent cap and just cause addendum. That you will rarely use that. And then they made an update on the square footage and lot size, or was reorganized to clarify each party's representations and acknowledgments. So they've updated that one. That's the square footage and lot size. So without further ado, let's get into the COP and start going over that one.
That's probably the
Again,
most.
anytime you see a form and you want to know if you're using the correct form, you'll see it right here at the top when they've updated it, and it says 1220.
This form is probably the one with the most, that's the most complex and probably maybe the best one for us to talk about first.
Yeah. So basically, you'll use this form when you have a buyer that's buying a property, but they have another home that they need to sell in order to buy that property. In the top of the form goes to clarify the purchase agreement that it's in. So you will list that at the very top of the form with the seller's property address between the buyer and the seller, blah, blah. So fill all that. That's the basic information. And then everything in red line, what you'll see is where they've made corrections or modifications to. Now, this could be subject to change because this is a red line version, but that's pretty much the gist of everything. If they change anything, it might be a word or two, but anything in red is what you're going to want to pay special attention to. So this is a contingency for the buyer on the purchase of that property they're going to put an offer in on. And it outlines in basically 1A, B, or C that the buyer's entering into a contract for the sale and closing and escrow on that buyer's property. And you'll check either only entering into a contract for sale of the buyer's property or only the close of escrow of the buyer's property, paragraph 4. And section C goes and outlines what the buyer's property is. Is it already in escrow? And what's the escrow number? And then you can attach a copy of the contact information and escrow number for that sale to submit with your offer.
A little bit of clarity.
Or you can check the box that it will be delivered to the seller within 2 days after acceptance. Now, obviously, in this market, if you're submitting an offer for a buyer and you want to make that offer look great, that seller's probably going to want to know at that time that property they're submitting on is actually an escrow, or at least the escrow information on it. Mark, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just a bit of clarity on 1B and 1C. Like, you might ask yourself, well, why would someone check 1B, only entering into a contract for the sale of the property, and 1C versus closing on the buyer's property to consummate the sale, their purchase that they want to conduct. And 1B is basically there, like, for the market we're in right now, highly competitive market, where maybe a buyer wants to say, look, all I want to do is get into a contract in order to, have that be my contingency. And I'm going to worry about, if I can close on it or not. And, so that 1B is a more aggressive statement by the buyer to the seller versus 1C, that actually, to close on the buyer's property in order to consummate the sale.
And would there ever be a time that you wouldn't check either of them, Mark?
I think that you would always want to pick 1C, and unless you, of course, it just, the paragraph following C applies. Copy of the contract. Okay. Well, no, you'd pick one or the other, 1C or 1B or 1C. I'm sorry.
So it's one or the other.
Yeah, it wouldn't be both for sure. But
Yeah.
the 1B, selecting 1B would be a more aggressive stance by the buyer to this more aggressive statement by the buyer to the seller.
Does
Okay.
1B leave you open for problems? Like, what if that contract for sale of the buyer's property falls through?
Yeah, it would mean that they'd have to perform anyway. Otherwise, the buyer would potentially be in default. So, like here's maybe a scenario. The buyer could, use alternate financing to purchase the property that they want to purchase without selling the property that they want to sell, but it would be better for them to sell it. But if they fail to sell it, they could still proceed to, close on their purchase. That might be, a scenario where you'd use 1B.
I see. A good solid backup plan.
Right, exactly.
So the recommended would be 1C.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
the
that's
safest
the
one.
safest for the buyer. That's why you're using the COP, is because, hey, I'm buying your house, but I have to really sell my other house. And by the way, here's how we're going to do it. So then going into item number 2, the buyer may enter into contract for sale of the buyer's property if 1A or 1B applies. So buyer shall have 17 days after acceptance to enter into a contract on the sale of the buyer's property. So that's if you have a buyer that has their home and it's, let's say it's not in escrow, then we're saying we're going to have up to 17 days, or by the earlier of the time specified in 2A, or within 2 or blank days after buyer entering into contract for the sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to seller and escrow holder. So let's say your buyer has their home on the market, but it's not in escrow yet. Depending on where they are, you would either go to 2A or 2B. Or 2A or 2B would apply. So if 2B is going to apply, if 2A is going to apply, then they basically saying we have 17 days after you accept our offer to enter into a contract to for the sale of this buyer's property. And then if we don't, then that's our contingency to get out, and you can cancel. You can send us a notice to perform, and if we can't perform, then you can cancel the contract, Mr. Seller. Or, and you can change it for, instead of 17 days, you can say, well, maybe we need 20 days or 25 days. But in this market, most sellers are not accepting anything other than less than 17 days, more than likely. Or by the earlier the time specified in paragraph 2A, or within 2 days after buyer entering a contract for the sale of the buyer's property, the buyer then needs to deliver the escrow evidence to seller and their escrow holder. So now you got to provide proof that it's actually an escrow, and they're going to want to see that. You don't have to send them the contract, but you have to show the evidence that the property's in escrow. Number 3, listing and MLS status of buyer's property. Either if 1A or 1B applies, then the buyer has a signed listing agreement for the buyer's property, or within 3 days after acceptance shall have a signed listing with you as the agent. So it would be if they have the property, it's not listed, but you're going to list it within a certain time frame within 3 days, or buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in the area where buyer's property is located, or buyer's property will not be listed with the MLS in the geographic area where the buyer's property is located. So scenario here is you have the buyer, you have the listing, and you're going to submit it to the MLS, or you might have an exclusion to not submit it. And maybe you're going to do a soft sell with somebody else. So you're not going to submit it to the MLS in the geographic area where it's located. And then item C, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the property listing, if applicable, the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance, if buyer's property is already listed with the real estate brokerage, or if not already listed, with 1 day after listing with the real estate brokerage.
So some of the changes that you're seeing in here are, giving the seller more evidence of what the buyer is doing and keeping these lines of communication open between the two parties. Whereas in the previous version, some of these evidentiary requirements were not there. So
that's really been the hook, the challenge with getting a COP is the seller on the property your buyer wants to buy. They really want to see, well, where is it? Is it listed, not listed? Listed? Is it, do you have a listing? Is it in the MLS, not in the MLS? And this kind of breaks it all down for all 3 different scenarios that they have here. And everybody's scenario is different. So each one of your buyers is going to have a different timeline that in regards, because some of your buyers want to go out and start searching for properties before you list, right? Because they're afraid that they can't sell if they don't have something to buy. So you're in this scenario where they want to go out and look, but they're not ready to put their home on the market. Is that true? Or you might have a scenario where the buyer is actually in escrow, and now they got to go find something. But hopefully, if that if you've got it in escrow, then you have the SPRP in place with that sale of that property. That's the seller's purchase of replacement property. So hopefully that's a whole nother document that they did not update, but that basically says that the seller has it in escrow, but they have an SPRP in place that says, hey, we're going to sell you our house, but we got to go buy something else. These chains are really fun and really stressful for agents once you start doing them. Sometimes we'll have a 4 to 5, 6 leg where everything falls apart because a buyer can't perform. And so the whole leg falls apart. And then item 4 wasn't updated, but it basically says if 1A or C apply, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of the buyer's property, the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property, or if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property. That was unchanged. And then item 5 is, this whole thing is new, right, Mark, the status?
Yeah, well, I mean, this item 5 is really kind of the gist of what we were just saying. Buyer agrees to keep the seller informed about the status of the transaction. Then, so it's added some steps in there in which the buyer has to keep the seller advised. And then there's
So basically,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, I was going to say what Mark said. I mean, it says, hey, buyer, keep us informed. We want to know.
And the
that
very
wasn't
last,
spelled out previously.
I'm sorry, Robert, the very last section there, 5B, the last sentence in that says buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of the removal of those identified contingencies. So again, it's tying together the communication between the parties, so that the seller's not out there wondering, well, what's going on?
This is where Mark and I spend a lot of our time whenever we have properties like this in escrow, because sometimes you'll get uncooperative agents that aren't keeping you informed about what's going on with the buyer's sale of the property, their property. So this is kind of outlining it. And then item 6 addresses the cancellation of the buyer's property. If the buyer's property is or enters escrow and either party of that escrow gives the other cancellation of contract, then the buyer, within 2 days after that, shall give seller written notice of that cancellation. So it's basically saying if your buyer has their home in escrow and that buyer cancels, then I'm going to let you know, Mr. Seller, that our sale of our primary residence just canceled. So I need to let you know that. And then figure out what we're going to do at that point. And then item 7, I'm loving every part of it, because this is where I would spend lots of time going through every contract, and so did Mark. What exactly, how can you take backup offers, and how can the seller require the buyer to remove the contingencies, or how do you can make them cancel? So item A addresses backup offers. After acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that brokers shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. So the rules in SDMLS and PSA are that if you have a fully executed contract and it's in escrow, even with a COP in place, you have to put it into pending status. Not contingent, pending. Is that correct, Mark?
I was gonna, I'm not clear on that, to be honest with you. I was gonna say it needed to be in contingent status rather than in pending status, but
Yeah,
we
it's
can
not.
get clear. We can get
It's
clarity.
not contingent, and there have been contracts that have been consummated where the seller says, the seller has the right to keep an active status in the MLS. And then at that point, then they can keep it in active status, but they have to prove that to the MLS. But the best thing for your buyer would be for that seller to put that property into pending status. But any offer, any home that's in the MLS that's in pending status, you can always write offers on those homes, whether there's a COP on them or not.
And we should add that if that does come up and that an agent does want to write an offer on a pending property, that you use this form called the backup offer addendum when you're submitting a backup offer if it's already in pending.
And then section B, removal of buyer contingencies and proof of funds. So this will address when do you actually start escrow. So unless it's 7C3 is selected, if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides a buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in 7C1 or 2, seller shall have the right to give written notice to the buyer in writing. I'm sorry, I totally misspoke. This is what happens if a buyer, if this seller has another backup offer, and they want to entertain that offer, the seller has the right to give the written notice to the buyer in writing, either remove the contingency, remove the loan contingency, if any, or provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of the buyer's property. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 or blank days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. And now let's go through what 7.1 and 2 mean. So when do all the contingencies need to be removed in timeline? So time to give notice to remove contingencies. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice provisions in paragraph 7B, either immediately right to notify buyer or delayed right to notify buyer, and it's templated to 17 days. In other words, if 2 or 3 are not checked, then what happens is 1 prevails, and it basically says that the seller can give the notice to that buyer to remove the contingency on the sale of their property. Or if 2 is checked, the seller can't tell that buyer to remove that contingency no earlier than 17 days after acceptance. Or if 3 is checked, no right to notify buyers. Seller shall not have the right to invoke the provisions of 7B during the entire term of the agreement. Which basically means that the seller cannot tell the buyer to remove the COP. Is that what you got out of the webinar, Mark?
Yeah, so, and this was in the prior form as well, and was the bogey in the situation using this form. If you are a listing agent and you receive this COP form from a buyer and 7C3 is checked, you definitely want to counter that out. Remove that by counter offer, because what it basically means is that the seller has no right to give the buyer notice to remove the contingency that they've granted.
Which really kind of made no sense. And then why have it?
It again, you know, it's a bit of a tripwire for a listing agent. If you miss that, it can be problematic for your seller.
And then the seller's right to cancel. So when can the seller have the right to cancel on your buyer's purchase? So there's a few scenarios. And somebody has their sound up. Can you turn your sound off, please? I don't want to hear my voice. After first giving buyer a written notice to remove the contingency and provide proof of funds, if buyer fails to take all actions specified in 7B, and remember 7B was the removal of buyer's contingencies and proof of funds, meaning they have to remove the contingency, remove the loan contingency, or provide verification of sufficient funds to close. So if any one of those would apply. After first giving a buyer notice to buyer to perform, if buyer fails to enter into contract for the sale of the buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 2A. So if you filled out 2A and whatever scenario you put in there, then that would allow the seller to give them a right to cancel by following what was in there. Or after first giving a notice to buyer to perform, if buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence with the time specified in paragraph 1C or 2B. After first giving a notice to buyer to perform, if buyer fails to deliver evidence of the listing property of buyer's property, or as applicable, the submission of the buyer's property listing to the MLS within the time specified in paragraph 3C. If buyer fails to deliver acceptance or removal of contingencies in the sale of buyer's property as specified in paragraph 5B, or if buyer gives notice to seller of either party's cancellation of contract for the buyer's property. That's pretty much every freaking scenario that we've covered on using a COP that is now kind of spelling out how the seller can, their right to cancel. I know that's a lot to unpack. Again, we do highly recommend that if you are consummating a transaction where the buyer's property has a home in escrow, that you do seek guidance if you're not quite sure how to fill this out. And then number 9 specifies the buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal of the buyer's property contingency specified 1A, B, or C, or if 1A or B applies and buyer is unable to enter the contract on buyer's property within the time specified, or applies and either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract for purchased buyer's property, or if 1A or C applies that the buyer is unable to close escrow on buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. So this kind of lays out all the scenarios for the buyer being able to cancel and get out of the contract. And then item 10 reviews the time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer deposit. So this section covers, well, you have a fully executed offer. When do the timelines begin? And A kind of talks about that. You can have the timelines begin as specified in the agreement, meaning if you have a fully executed offer today, then day 1 is tomorrow. Or you can check the box on the day after buyer delivers to the seller the following: either escrow evidence, buyer's election in writing signed by the buyer to begin time periods, meaning the buyer delivers, okay, we want to begin the time periods, or buyer's removal of the COP. So removal of this. So again, that's a negotiable thing as well too. Most people are beginning their time periods at the beginning if they have their primary home in escrow already, or at least listed. You would never not check the box or on the day after buyer delivers to seller if you don't even have the property listed for sale, because you're putting your buyer at a disadvantage. They still have to get their home sold. And then the second part talks about, well, when you want to deliver to escrow the buyer's deposit. So you can either do it as time specified in the agreement, or 3 days after buyer delivers the same thing they delivered above. Now you could split the two as well too. You can say, well, we'll put the money in escrow, but time frames don't begin until we tell you they begin, by selecting one of the 3 above. Does that make sense? I think I explained that well, Mark.
Yeah.
Any questions on that, guys? And then, of course, be kind with your TCs as well, as they help you navigate through this too. because they're learning these forms, the updated forms as well. And it's very challenging for them to work their timelines out too on multi-leg transactions.
And we only use this form when a buyer has their home in escrow, correct?
No, when the buyer has a home that they want to sell, it may or may not be in escrow. But in order for them to buy a property, they have to sell that other property. That's their contingency.
Thank you.
And then notice to remove buyer contingencies, provide proof of funds. Seller hereby gives notice to buyer to remove the contingencies and take action specified in 7B. What's that, Mark? That's new.
Well, so this portion of this form is what the buyer uses, or the seller, gives the buyer notice to remove the contingency that's been defined in 7C.
Oh, okay.
You don't use a notice to buyer to perform for to request the buyer to remove the COP contingency. You use the bottom of this form to give them the notice. And then if they fail to do that, then you would proceed to one of the items in section 9.
Then what did they do the NBP update for?
Because the NBP has some well, when we look at that form, you'll see some new sections on it that pertain.
Right, let's go to that then. Okay, so this was updated. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so it basically ties into the new COP form, and there's new sections in section I, the left-hand column, where we have G and H added, entering into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property. So that would be in COP paragraph 2, and then section 1, or IH, whatever that is, 1H on the left side, close of escrow of the buyer's property. That's defined in paragraph 4 of the COP. And then on the right-hand side of the column, we have new sections V, W, X, and those, are for contractual action paragraphs. Provide the escrow evidence for sale of buyer's property, provide evidence of the listing. So again, this form, this notice to buyer to perform, is giving the seller these options to force the buyer to communicate these things in order to keep the contingency moving along so that the seller's informed. A lot of glazed over stares and looks on this.
Yeah, well, rightfully so.
Yeah,
and we'll kind of break it down. We'll break it down in its simplest form once we go through this, what it really means. And then here's the contingency release form that your buyer will submit, where they can remove those contingencies. Those are the ones in red in items section 7A or B that the seller's asking that the buyer remove, either entering into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property or close of escrow for the buyer's property.
Robert, can you scroll back onto that notice to buyer to perform? Or, yeah, so then please, that note section there is new, just above where the buyer signs, or the notice to the buyer, where it says note paragraph numbers refer to the RPA. So when you see these things where it's talking about paragraph 5B and so forth, they're tying into the RPA, not into the actual form, not into the CO or notice to buyer to perform form. So that this is by default. You look at the top of the notice to buyer to perform, scroll up a little bit more, please. In a little bit more. Okay, right there. So you see it says, in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, or you could define another form. The final form is slightly different than what you're seeing on the screen there. But it basically, you can, by default, it refers to the purchase agreement, and that's why that note is there, because referring to the RPA sections. But if you define another form, then, maybe you're using an RIPA or something like that, then you'd have to change those form sections because they may be different. Most of the forms are, the RIPA and the RPA are close, but you have to be careful when you're filling these things out to make sure you're referencing the right sections.
But don't forget to check this box, because the majority of you, 99% of the time, will be using the RPA.
Yeah. Again, what you're seeing on Robert's screen is slightly different than the final version. The version I'm looking at from the car legal presentation just says in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement. So by default, it makes it the purchase agreement. There's no checkbox unless you want to define some other purchase agreement and all of these or some other form. And all of these other ones that are listed here on the screen, residential income, commercial property, those are not on the notice to buyer to perform in its final version. It just says purchase agreement or checkbox, and you fill in the blank if it's something other than the purchase agreement.
And then we're done with those forms.
Yeah, that's the hardest part.
Yeah. All right, so here's the basics of the COP. You have a buyer wants to go buy a house, but they have a home they have to sell. And that home is either going to not be listed, it's going to be listed, but not in the MLS. It's going to be listed in the MLS. It's going to be listed in the MLS and in pending. So those are the 4 different scenarios you will have. So depending upon what scenario that is, either it's not listed, it's listed, not MLS, listed not in the MLS, listed in the MLS, listed in the MLS, and pending, then that will determine how you fill out this form and what timelines you want to give. The biggest challenge too is if it's listed in the MLS and it's pending, you want to make sure that that pending sale is pretty much wrapped up and good to go. So it's a game of cat and mouse to make all that stuff come together, because you want to make sure that buyer on that, the buyer on this, the buyer's home that they're selling is going to complete that transaction. And this is where you all have heart flutters and palpitations, because it's kind of a stressful transaction. I walk through agents a lot of this stress during this period because it's hard on everybody. It's hard on the buyers, it's hard on the sellers, hard on the agents. And my main recommendation whenever you're in this type of transaction is everybody needs to have a little give and take. And hopefully you have a agent on the other side of the transactions that are a little more workable and not so hard-lined, because that's going to make everybody all stressed out. Again, we're always here to help walk you through this.
And I think another good point to make here is that, when you have one of these complex transactions, you have to keep the line of communication open with the cooperating side. And don't just send notices to perform. Let them know, hey, look, the time passed for this, and so we really have to send you a notice to perform. To just say, oh, they may have just missed it, and they don't want all of a sudden you resend them this angry notice to perform. So, I really think keeping the lines of communication open between the buyer's agent, listing agent, and the seller and buyer are really key to making these things happen and close.
And let's run a scenario on a notice to buyer or notice to buyer to perform. So let's say the buyer has 17 days to perform. Otherwise, the seller can send a notice to buyer to perform. And per the contract right now, it's templated to 2 days. So technically, some listing agents will send a notice to buyer to perform on the 15th day. Because once you send that notice to buyer to perform, that starts the timelines for that buyer to remove that contingency. So some listing agents will actually be on their timelines with the 2-day delivery notice because they want to keep everything going. And
That's
usually they'll tell you in advance.
There's another interesting point with that, Robert, and it is that the purchase agreement defines those time periods for the notice to perform and the demand to close escrow at 2 days and 3 days, I believe. And if you have a short escrow, less than 30 days, I define as a short escrow, you can change those notice periods in RPA 14 to 1 day or 2 days. Because if you have a very short escrow, you don't have time to wait 2 days before you can send a notice. So, but if you fail to shorten those time periods in 14, you can't send a notice sooner than the 2 days or 3 days that's defined in section 14 of the RPA.
All right. And then the final form we're going to cover today is the new form that's coming out, and it's the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. This is because the entire state of California is a tinderbox. And now sellers are required to disclose if their home is in a high fire zone. This, Mark, you were not on the call. You may or may not know this. This is now one of the required forms, like the TDS and the SBQ, that can have a right of rescission.
Right. And there's also a key point with this form that if a party, like seller typically, has a legitimate exclusion to not complete a TDS, then, for example, they're acting in a fiduciary capacity and they have no knowledge of the property and they're exempt from disclosure, they are also exempt from the HHDA. So that those two things follow. If you have a transaction where you have an exempt seller and they use the ESD form, the exempt seller disclosure, they are also exempt from this HHDA.
So it applies to residential units 1 to 4 units. And Mark just mentioned the exemptions and then the cancellation right, just as the TDS does.
Yeah, and this form can be a little bit confusing too, because you have to refer to the natural hazard zone report in order to determine, like in section 1, if the home is in a high or very high fire hazard area. And so some of the NHD reports, distinguish different categories or levels, let's call it, of fire hazard. Some of them may say low or they may say medium. Well, should I still use this HHDA form in that case? And this HHDA, you may notice that it does say that it's a disclosure and an advisory. And so it can be used in an advisory capacity.
So we have a question from Alicia.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Are we suggesting now then that the NHD gets ordered when we take the listing, so that way the seller is able to properly fill out this document?
That would be a good point, especially if you have a short time period for, the seller, which by default it's 7 days to deliver all disclosures to the buyer. So if you don't order an NHD until you have a property under contract and it takes a day or two to get it, you can see how the time period might run out before the seller could contractually comply with making all the disclosures they need to.
So here's what they said on the car call. The NHD person, so the natural hazard person, will give you the correct info. So yes, Alicia, rely on getting the NHD in advance because they'll give you the correct info. And you can help the seller if they are in a zone, meaning to tell them whether or not they need to disclose. And the questions in this disclosure are based upon their actual knowledge. And this, I'm going to drop into the chat bar the data to figure out whether or not it's in a fire zone. So good question, Alicia. Yes. Now I need to get back to my notes. Getting the NHD in advance or working with a really good NHD provider will help you determine what the seller needs to disclose or not disclose. And it's with every home that's within a high or very high fire hazard zone. And I said on the call, well, that's pretty much the entire state of California. So a lot of it is you're going to have to use your judgment. If you're in Ramona, that might be a very high fire because of all the Santa Ana winds that get out there. And if it's built before 2010 and it's 1 to 4 units, and then that is the form. And they're going to answer those questions. And it's based upon a seller's knowledge at the time. And there's also a website link within the form right there called readyforwildfire.org. That they can get online information about as well too, to figure out if their home is located in a high fire. I would just primarily do any home that's in a community that's anything east of 805. We've seen during the fires of 2008, they went through the Carmel Valley Ranch, Carmel Mountain Ranch, Rancho Bernardo.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say, make the determination based on the location. Obviously there's some logic to what you're saying. There are some areas that are more high fire hazard than not. I think I would, defer to make the decision to include this on the year built before 1/1/2010. And 2, what the NHD report says. And again,
yes,
this is.
I think what I was trying to say though was, you can pretty much guarantee anything east of the 805 is going to probably be in it, but that doesn't mean anything west of the 805. Like you could be in some canyons in Mission Valley, up in Mission Hills. That kind of is high fire zone.
Yeah,
there was times where there was a big fire in University Heights through the canyon and wiped out a bunch of homes. South Park, North Park, anything that's in a canyon area. So sorry, Mark.
No, that's okay. I was pretty much done. There is one other form that's new. If we still have time and want to go through that one, which is the square footage and lot size advisory. That had some revisions done to it.
Okay, what's up?
Basically, they redesigned it to make it a little bit more logical, re-emphasizing in paragraph 3 that the broker has, I think you have an old form there that you're showing, that paragraph 3 shows, that brokers and agents don't have expertise in this. There's separate signature blocks now for the buyer and seller, and the seller should typically sign this before the buyer signs it. Seller, is making certain representations, by signing the form. And then there's a section in here too, where it says it could be informational. So this came up this week where, form was tendered by the seller to the buyer, but there was nothing disclosed in section 4. And, they were basically providing it because of the informational aspects of it. Again, you read the title of it and it says it's an advisory and a disclosure. So this form, it can be given as an advisory as well as making a disclosure if the information is known. That's pretty much it.
Do we get some pushback on this though? Sometimes were we getting pushback on why do we have to do this one?
No, not really.
Okay. Oh, it was the PSD that we got a lot of pushback on.
Yeah, that parking and storage disclosure, sometimes it's a little bit misunderstood as when it can be used.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right, you guys. Hope we totally confused you. If
I think
not,
everyone's,
well, Confucius say, keep mouth closed, appear dumb, then open up and remove all doubt. So I think a lot of you guys might be afraid, like, I don't understand this. Don't worry about it. That's what we're here for. Just make sure you're using the COP. If you have first off, when you represent a buyer, you want to ask them a question. Do you have a home to sell before you buy your next one? Great. Then you know you're going to use this form called the COP to protect them. And that's really what you kind of want to, when you're talking with the buyers out there. Well, we really need to go buy a house, but we're afraid we can't buy one because we have to sell this one first. Well, we have a form for that. We can actually protect you on the sale of that, your primary home, and go buy you a new one. And if you don't sell the other one, we have a way to protect you with that. So you're getting your potential buyers engaged to buy a new home and sell their existing one. And a lot of sellers don't actually know that. And believe it or not, we've actually had agents that don't know that there's a form called the COP. And they'll just put into the purchase agreement, purchase contingent upon the buyer closing their home on their current home. Well, that doesn't spell anything out, and that could be a contract going south really quick. All right, guys. Great seeing you all.
thanks everyone for attending.
Have a great day.